midday on September 16th, 2008, the captain of the Staten Island ferry in New York City was looking out at the water just south of Manhattan, and he noticed something bobbing in the water. And he said that it just didn't look right. He was drawn to it. It was pretty far away, but he knew that there was just something off about it. Couldn't tell if it was a person or debris, but either way, he sent two of his deckhands over to have a look. So they hopped in a skiff, they drove over, and very quickly they saw that it was actually a woman, and her face was in the water. So as soon as they pulled up alongside her, the first thing they did is grabbed her head and kind of pulled it out of the water, and to their surprise, she gasped for air. They pulled her up into the skiff. She had on just running shorts and a sports bra. She had a very bad sunburn on one side of her body. She was hypothermic, she was dehydrated, and she looked like she had been in the water for a very long time. They bring her back to the ferry, they wrap her up in a blanket, and they call 911, and an ambulance is immediately sent out to go get her. As they're waiting for the ambulance, she starts to speak. "I was just out for a run. I went running just a couple hours ago. Why am I here?" They chalked it up to her being in shock, and based on her attire, she had running shorts and a sports bra on. They're thinking, okay, I don't know how she wound up in the water, but it seems like she went running, fell in the water somehow, and thank goodness we found her. She gets in the ambulance, they bring her to the hospital, and after the initial treatment is done and she's stable and laying in bed and being treated for hypothermia and for this bad sunburn, she starts saying to nurses and doctors she had just gone running like a couple hours ago. How did I get here? Why was I in the water? And they didn't know either. Finally, when she was able to confirm that she was in fact Hannah Upp, and they got in touch with her family, who also confirmed that this girl sitting in the hospital bed is in fact Hannah Upp, investigators were baffled because Hannah Upp had been missing for 3 weeks, not one day. When they said this to Hannah, she couldn't believe it. At first, everyone was okay with Hannah not being able to remember because she just went through something traumatic. We'll give her a couple of days and then we'll reapproach the subject. But as time went on, it became clear that Hannah had absolutely no clue what happened over a 3-week period that she had been missing. 3 weeks before she was found, she had left her apartment in New York City to go for a run. This was the day before she was set to start a new school year at her school in Harlem. When Hannah did not return to her apartment that night, her roommates actually didn't think much of it. From what I can tell, the roommates were not particularly close, and it wasn't unusual for them to kind of have limited interaction. 4 days would go by before Hannah's roommates would notice that she still hasn't come back. So the first thing they did is they went into her bedroom inside of the apartment, and they quickly were able to find that her passport was in there, her wallet with her cash, bank cards, her ID. Basically, all of the most important items that you would carry with you anywhere you went were sitting in her room. At this point, they called the police, and a massive, massive search is ignited for this woman. Hannah was beloved, not only by her family, but everywhere she went, her students loved her. All of her friends would say that Hannah was their best friend. Everybody she was around loved her. She was the center of attention, life of the party. And so when she became a missing person, people came out of the woodwork to go look for this woman. They looked everywhere, and after a week, the family and friends were starting to lose hope, and the police would admit that at that point, they were just looking for a body. They assumed that she had been the victim of some horrible crime. Her case, her missing person case, had made national headlines because it didn't really make any sense. There was absolutely no trace of her. She'd just gone running and then vanished. And despite living in New York City, where there's cameras everywhere and witnesses everywhere, they couldn't find any footage of her. They had no leads. No one came forward. The New York Times would say it was as if the city had opened wide and swallowed her whole. Then there was this huge break in the case because there was an Apple store in Midtown Manhattan that spotted her clearly entering their store and logging into one of their computers. They saw that she logged in with her email address, but on that computer there was no record of her sending or receiving any messages. But she did successfully log in. And oddly enough, one of the people that went to school with her approached her and was like, "Hannah? Hannah, is that you? There's a huge search for you. Is this really you?" Hannah on camera looks at him and says, "No, I'm not Hannah." And she ups and walks away. Police show up. There's no sign of Hannah. She's gone. Police took the footage and showed it to Hannah's mother, and she recognized her 100%. That is Hannah. But no one could understand, why would she deny being Hannah? Is she being held hostage? A day later, she popped up on the security camera at a Starbucks in Manhattan. But just like the Apple store, by the time the report got to the police and they went to the Starbucks, she was gone. Same thing happened at a number of Manhattan gyms where she was apparently going and using their shower and then leaving. And she somehow was able to get inside the gym, but she didn't have her gym pass. So they don't know how she got in. And again, every time police showed up, she'd be gone. And there's lots of other unanswered questions. How are you able to do anything? You don't have your license, you don't have your wallet, you don't have bank cards, you don't have a passport. We don't know where you're sleeping, where you're staying. How are you eating? What are you doing? Where are you coming from? What's wrong? While police were never able to determine where she had been sleeping at night in those first couple of weeks, they did determine that at some point towards the end of this 3-week period, she decided to leave Manhattan. And so she jumped into a kayak off of Chelsea Pier and began paddling south. And at some point, we don't know when, she jumped out of the kayak and began swimming south. And after several hours of swimming, she wound up at Robbins Reef, which is this incredibly isolated lighthouse that sits on this tiny little rocky island. She managed to pull herself up onto the island and then sat there on these rocks for almost 24 hours. This is where police believe she got the really bad sunburn. Then some event led to her getting back in the water and kind of bobbing and drifting her way all the way back over to the south side of Manhattan, where she was ultimately spotted and then rescued by the ferry captain. It took police and investigators quite a bit of time to put together this storyline of what happened to Hannah over those 3 weeks. And when they brought it to her and her family and said, "This is what we think happened to you," she still had no idea how any of this had happened. She thought she'd gone running, and then the same day she wound up in the water and was being rescued. While she was at the hospital, she had undergone a series of brain imaging tests to try to see what they could find, if there was some underlying neurological condition that might have caused her to forget this huge chunk of time. But the tests revealed no neurological issues. They concluded that the episode was psychological in nature. Because her case had made national headlines just when she had gone missing in the first place, and then had been found under such baffling conditions, not only physically where she was located, but her inability to remember any of it, it created even more buzz around the whole story. And so people began to think she was lying or that she had staged the whole thing, but she hadn't. She just didn't understand why it had happened. But as time went on, people forgot about it, people moved on, and she was able to more or less go back to a normal life, even though she herself was very unsettled at the idea that she had 20 days that she has no memory of. Fast forward almost exactly 5 years to September of 2013, and now Hannah is living in Maryland. She is an assistant teacher at a Montessori school, and Hannah goes missing again. On the day she went missing, co-workers claimed to have seen her just a couple miles away from the school, and they assumed that she was walking to work. But she didn't show up for work that day, and when they tried calling her, she didn't pick up. They went to her apartment, she wasn't there, and so just like 5 years earlier, they called the police and they launched a search for Hannah Upp. Early on in the search, police located Hannah's phone and wallet sitting on a walking path relatively close to where she worked. But they started searching the area and they could not find her. 2 days after the search started, Hannah's mother received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. When she picked it up, it was her daughter. And she said, "I don't know where I am, I don't know what's going on, but I'm okay." Hannah had regained her memory while laying in a creek bed next to a turned over shopping cart in some random park in Maryland, not the one where her phone and wallet were found. She had stood up, had no idea how she got there, and she flagged down a stranger and asked to use their phone and was able to call her mother. Her family, her friends, the police were all so relieved that she was found and unharmed that, much like the last one, she ultimately was released from the hospital because she wasn't hurt and was able to more or less move back into a normal life. Except Hannah at this point felt really guilty. She didn't understand why this was happening, but she felt really bad about it. And it was clear to her family and friends that she really wished she could somehow have a do-over, to just start fresh and start a new life where no one knew her as this person who keeps disappearing. A year after the Maryland incident, Hannah would move to the US Virgin Islands, a popular location for Americans that want to start again or go off the grid. She was able to land a job teaching at a Montessori school teaching 3 to 6-year-old children, and the director of the program would say that whenever they brought a family on a tour of the different classrooms, Hannah's classroom was always the first one they went to because she was such a great example of what children would expect if they came to this Montessori school. because Hannah was not just a great teacher, she was a passionate teacher. She loved teaching, she loved her students, and she loved her new life in the Virgin Islands. But in September 2017, 9 years after her disappearance in New York and 4 years after her disappearance in Maryland, Hannah would go missing for a third time. Now, the lead up to this disappearance is a little bit unique relative to the other two. Right before she disappeared, there was a Category 5 hurricane barreling down on the Virgin Islands, and all of Hannah's friends, colleagues, everyone she knew was scrambling to leave the islands before it hit. But Hannah was not prepared to abandon the island and abandon her house and her school, and so she decides to stay behind. In the final few days before all of her friends and colleagues left the island, they described Hannah as being in some sort of a trance. She was hard to get through to, hard to speak to, but she seemed rather sing-songy, like she was in a really good mood, but very difficult to communicate with. On September 15th, just a few days before the hurricane would actually make landfall, the few staff members at the Montessori school who had stayed behind on the island to weather the storm called a meeting, and Hannah was not present. She was last seen preparing her Montessori classroom for the imminent impact of the hurricane. When they went to her apartment, she wasn't there, and so they went out looking for her. One of her friends knew that a favorite location of Hannah's was Sapphire Beach, and when she got there, sure enough, there was Hannah's car parked in the parking lot with her purse, passport, and hundreds of dollars inside of her car. Hannah's clothes were found down on the beach on a chair, neatly folded, but there was no sign of Hannah anywhere. A desperate search for Hannah was launched, led by the Coast Guard, but it had to be abandoned after only a couple of days because the hurricane was barreling down on them. And to this day, she has never been seen or heard from again. There's a huge part of this story that I've intentionally left out until right now. After Hannah was scooped up by the ferry captain and brought to the hospital after that first disappearance in 2008, they ran all those brain tests and they discovered that there was nothing wrong with her from a neurological standpoint. However, they did run a series of psychological tests and they discovered that she had an extremely rare form of amnesia called dissociative fugue. For those that suffer it, there are no symptoms leading up to it, and then all of a sudden you forget all of your autobiographical information, but you don't forget how to live. Someone in a fugue state could very easily leave their apartment, go to a store, interact with other people. They just don't understand who they are. They don't know their name, they don't know their history, they don't know why they are located where they are. This can last for a couple of hours, all the way to years. The most famous example of dissociative fugue is Jason Bourne from the big blockbuster movies about the CIA operative who wakes up and has no idea who he is or why he is where he is. He doesn't know the people around him, but he recalls all of his training and is able to be this like ninja who can fight off bad guys left and right but doesn't know who he is. Now, when Hannah disappeared in 2008, almost certainly she was in a fugue state and then was located again, and thankfully she was alive. 5 years later, same thing happens in Maryland. She goes into a fugue state, and then 2 days later she's found again, has no idea how she got where she got, but there she was. Now, the tricky part is, in 2017, when she went missing, it would be very easy to say that she was in a fugue state because it had already happened 2 times before. However, other people believe that she just wanted to start her life over again. She hated being known only for her 2 disappearances. She wanted to be known as a happy, loving person, a great teacher, a great friend. And none of that was possible with her history. And so some say that she staged the last disappearance because she knew with the hurricane coming in that she would be able to kind of disappear without a trace and people would assume that she was probably dead. So I'd love to get your take on what happened to Hannah Upp, specifically what happened the 3rd time she disappeared. Was this just another example of her being in a fugue state and disappearing? And will we hear from her again? Or did she stage all of this to run away from Hannah Upp and start all over again with a brand new identity, not tethered to the history that she really would like to forget? In 1981, Maurice Doc Demetz was an 84-year-old man living in Colorado. He was a lifelong minister, had a PhD in theology. He also had a blood condition, and he had arthritis in his knees that made it almost impossible for him to walk without assistance. He had always been really passionate about topaz hunting. He would go to these sites where you could dig into the ground and look for these rocks. When you broke them open, you could potentially find topaz. And he loved doing that. Because of his knees and because of his blood condition, he needed someone to go with him to walk him around to the different dig sites and to help him get back into the car and drive him back to his house. Doc had a friend named David McSherry. He wound up being the primary guy that would go with Doc anytime he went topaz hunting. On April 29th, 1981, Doc decides he wants to go topaz hunting. So he calls up David, and they load up David's car, and they head off to Pike National Forest, which was a spot they had gone many times before. And they had this one area that they used to love going in particular called Devil's Head. Locals in the area claimed that that spot was actually haunted by evil spirits. But to Doc and to David, there was no indication that they bought into any of that, and they went there all the time. When they got there on April 29th at 10 a.m., they got out, they went to their favorite dig sites. David actually walked Doc down this hill to this one little clearing. Doc had a backpack with him full of the tools he used to dig out the different rocks. After David had walked Doc to this spot, David walked back up the hill towards their car and went about 50 yards away from where Doc was to his dig site. And over the next several hours, the two would work independent of one another, just digging for topaz. Periodically, David would look over and he'd make sure that he could see Doc and make sure Doc was okay. At 3:45 in the afternoon, David decides, all right, it's probably time to get going soon. And he pokes his head up and he looks in the direction of where Doc was supposed to be, and Doc's not there. He had just seen him about 15 minutes earlier, so he's not concerned. He knows it's only been a few minutes, and frankly, Doc can't really go anywhere. He can barely walk. And so he just kind of stands up and maybe tries to get a better look, and he's thinking, okay, maybe Doc stood up and got behind a tree to relieve himself, or maybe he kind of is just out of sight, and he starts walking down to the area to just go find Doc. But Doc isn't there, and neither is his backpack with all of his tools. And David's sitting there thinking, I guess Doc must have packed up and headed back to the car. But then David's thinking to himself, in order to go from this dig site up to the car, it means walking up a fairly steep embankment. And there's no way that Doc would have been able to do that without assistance. And so he's looking around the area thinking, is there any sign of something bad happening here? There's no blood. There's no sign of any sort of altercation that would have happened here. David certainly didn't hear anything going on near him. He didn't hear an animal attack or anything like that. So he thinks, okay, somehow he must have got up to the car. David walks up the embankment all the way to the car. Doc's not up there. David goes in the car and he starts honking the horn and yelling out for Doc. No response. As he's honking the horn, 3 motorists come down the road. They see David honking the horn, and so they say, hey, what's going on? David tells them, hey, I got my 84-year-old friend. I don't know where he went. He can't have gone far. Can you guys help me look for him? But after David and these motorists spend a couple of hours looking in this area and there's no sign of him, they end up calling the authorities. The police show up, and over the next week, there is this extensive search in this whole area that includes bloodhounds and hundreds of people. But despite this massive effort, nothing is ever found of Doc. He just vanishes. And so Doc's wife writes a letter to the governor of Colorado and just says, he can't have done this on his own. He can't have walked away on his own. Someone or something lifted him up and took him away. There was no response to this letter, and ultimately Doc's case was shut down. They stopped looking for him and assumed he had died. But when David Paulides looked into this case and featured the Doc Demetz case on his documentary, they actually reopened the case. But as of right now, there's no new additional details about the whereabouts of Doc Demetz. To this day, we don't know what happened to him. In 2014, Jim McGrogan was a 39-year-old medical doctor who was living in Indiana with his wife and his 2 kids. He was widely regarded as a very loving husband and devoted father, and everybody seemed to just love this guy. Jim was in phenomenal shape. He had run marathons, triathlons. He loved being in the outdoors, hiking, rock climbing, snowshoeing, skiing. That was Jim's happy place. And so in early March 2014, Jim decides he wants to plan a trip with some friends to go hiking in Colorado. And so he begins planning out where they're going to go hiking, and he finds this amazing trail right opposite the very famous Vail ski resort. Even though Jim was very competent in the outdoors, he would take a survival class and an avalanche preparedness class before he left for Colorado, just to show his wife that he wasn't taking any chances, that he would be well prepared in case the worst were to happen on this trip. About 2 weeks later, he's in Colorado and he heads to a ski shop where he rents a split snowboard as well as loads up on all the supplies that you might need for being in the outdoors. Early the next day, Jim and his friends arrive at the trailhead. Jim, in his backpack, had his cell phone. He also had an extra cell phone battery. He had a great GPS. In addition, he had loads of food and water. He had his split snowboard. He has his avalanche beacon. He's got extra clothing. I mean, this guy is well outfitted for this trip. So they start on this hike, and by 10 a.m. that morning, the rest of the group is feeling tired and wants to take a break. Jim doesn't want to take a break. He's in amazing shape and he wants to keep going. So he says, hey guys, I'm going to walk just a little bit farther up and I'll meet you at our next planned stop. No one bats an eye because Jim is like this total stud. He knows what he's doing. And they're like, all right, go ahead. We'll see you up there. Once the group is well rested, they stand back up and they keep walking. They get to that first stop and Jim's not there. They think, okay, we were sitting there for a little while. I'm sure he just went to the next planned stop because they had planned stops all along the route. The trail they were on, because it had snowed significantly that winter and lots of people had been on this trail, the trail itself was totally packed down to the dirt. So it was very easy to identify this trail. Anywhere there wasn't trail was covered in snow. And so if you were walking this trail, it would be really easy to stay on it. Also, if you were to deviate from the trail and start walking away, it would be really obvious because people would see your footprints leaving the trail. But as Jim's friends are making their way up this trail and not seeing Jim at each of these subsequent stops, they don't see any footprints leaving the trail. So they just figure he must have gone all the way to the end. He's just way ahead of us. But by 5 p.m., when they made it all the way up to the top where they planned on stopping and turning around, Jim wasn't there, and they hadn't passed him on the way up, and they hadn't seen any footprints or any ski tracks or anything to indicate that someone had left the path. And so very worried about Jim, they called the authorities. Over the next 5 days, a massive search is launched in this area, including 3 helicopters that scoured an 18-mile square radius. They had scent sniffing dogs out there. They had all these very experienced mountaineers combing the area, but they couldn't find any sign of him. And again, because of all the snow outside of that trail they were on, the helicopter just searched up and down that trail looking for indications that someone had left the trail, looking for those footprints or ski tracks just off that trail they were on, and there weren't any. There was no sign that anyone had left the trail at any point. Yet Jim was gone. The authorities, friends, family, everybody's baffled, but they're thinking to themselves, Jim's a really competent outdoorsman. He has a working GPS. And they checked their cell phones. That whole area they were in, they had cell phone reception. So they're thinking to themselves, we don't know what's going on, but I'm sure he's going to turn up at some point. 20 days after Jim went missing, his body is discovered by 2 hikers 7 kilometers away from the trail he had been on when he went missing. He had died from significant head trauma as well as a broken femur. It looked like he had fallen from a really great height, but it wasn't entirely clear where he had actually fallen from. He was found with just leggings and a shirt on, no jacket and no boots, and his boots were nowhere to be found. His backpack was next to him, and inside of it was his GPS that worked and his cell phone that worked. He even had an extra battery for his cell phone. Yet at no point had he tried to use his cell phone over the duration of the time he had been out there. He also had lots of food and water and additional clothing. He had a tent, but it looked like none of it had been touched since he packed it originally. And then strangest of all is there were no footprints or ski tracks leading up to either where he was or any of the surrounding areas. There were no tracks to show how he actually got where he got. It's as if he had been lifted off the trail 7 kilometers away and dropped where he was. When the exact location of where he was found was communicated back to the authorities, the helicopter pilots who had been involved in that initial 5-day search said that we looked at that area multiple times and he wasn't there. So at some point after those 5 days, Jim had found a way to land 7 kilometers away in this random place where there's no footprints that lead to it, no tracks, no anything. We know he had a working cell phone and a working GPS, and we know that he didn't make it to this spot where he ultimately was found in the first 5 days. So at a minimum, What was he doing in those first 5 days? Why wasn't he using his cell phone to communicate what was going on? Why wasn't he using his GPS to get back to safety? Why didn't he use the supplies in his backpack to save his life? Why did he take his boots off? And then how did he wind up in the location he was in? Because there was no tracks that would have led to that spot. In 1958, Bobby Bisup was a 10-year-old living in Colorado. He was almost completely deaf, so he wore a hearing aid, and he came from a family that was devoutly Catholic. That summer, Bobby's family decided to send him to a Catholic camp for boys. It was located at the St. Malo Church inside of Rocky Mountain National Park. The camp itself was situated at the base of Mount Meeker. Anytime the boys were up the mountain, which was pretty steep, they could always look down and see this camp. In addition, there was this stream that fed right by the camp. So if they could just get to the stream anytime they were up in the mountain, they could follow it all the way down and get back to the camp. This was something that they told all of the boys in case they got lost up in the mountain. On August 15th, around 6 p.m., Bobby was a little ways up from the camp fishing along that river. And one of the camp counselors was making his way up to try to get all the boys to come back down for dinner. This camp counselor would say that he clearly saw Bobby recognize that it was time to come back down, it was time for dinner. He clearly saw Bobby turn and start walking down towards the camp. At which point the counselor turned his back on Bobby and he too began walking down towards the camp, which was not very far away. When the counselor got to the camp and turned back around though, Bobby was gone. And so the counselor starts immediately tracing his steps back to try to find Bobby, but he can't find him anywhere. The counselor goes and gets a number of the other counselors to come help him find Bobby. After about 30 minutes, no sign of Bobby. He's just gone. The camp counselors are looking around thinking, how is this possible? He was literally right there. He started walking, he was right behind me. How could he have gotten lost in such a short amount of time and in an area where he could literally see the camp and was actually on the river that leads right back to the camp? It didn't make any sense. The counselors alerted authorities and this massive search is launched to find Bobby. Over 300 people come out, including people from the military. It's this huge search and nothing is found of this boy. He's completely gone. 10 days after he went missing, they had to call off the search because there was absolutely no sign of this child. Even after the search ended, many of the camp counselors continued to, in their off time, scour the area around the camp to look for Bobby. And a year later, 3 camp counselors would actually find him. 3 camp counselors decided to go to a very hard to access area that had been searched previously, but they felt like it was the one spot that needed a little bit more attention. And it was 5 kilometers west of the camp and almost 800 yards up a fairly steep incline. This is a hard to access area, but they climbed their way up there, and sure enough, even though this area had been searched before, they found Bobby's hearing aid, bits of his clothing, and some of his bones. They didn't find any more of his remains, and no one knows what actually happened to him. But it really makes you wonder, what happened after the camp counselor turned his back on Bobby? It's as if someone scooped him up and flew him away. And even if he had intentionally run away, it would have been very difficult for a 10-year-old to get to that particular location where he was found. And to what end? Why would he have wanted to get up there? And so, like many of the other missing 411 cases, we are left with a series of questions and very few answers. In 2008, Brandon Swanson was a 19-year-old college student enrolled in a community college in a little town in Minnesota called Canby. The town had a population of less than 1,000 people. He lived in Marshall, Minnesota, which was about 30 minutes away and was only slightly larger than Canby. Brandon was in his sophomore year at the community college and planned at the end of the year to transfer to a much larger 4-year university where he would complete his degree. On the last day of classes that year, on May 13th, Brandon and some of his friends decided to go out and celebrate, because not only did they now have this nice vacation, but for Brandon it was a big deal. He was getting ready to transfer to that larger school. So that night, Brandon met up with his friends kind of near where they went to school. There was a couple different backyard barbecue type college parties going on, and Brandon was having a good time with his friends, and at some point a little after midnight he decided he was just ready to go home. He was tired. Instead of taking the preferred route, which would have been Highway 68 back to his home in Marshall, Minnesota, he decided to take some back roads. Later, when police were interviewing some of the people that were at those 2 backyard parties that Brandon had attended, they asked how much was Brandon drinking. And they all said that Brandon wasn't really drinking at all. We saw him with one beer that he wasn't really drinking, and it seemed like he really was just tired. He wasn't looking to party, and he left and seemed very sober. As Brandon is taking these back roads back to his home in Marshall, Minnesota, he ends up getting into a minor accident, but his car gets stuck in the ditch. So he can't get his car out of the ditch. He's totally stranded. The first thing he does is he calls his friends that were at the parties with him, but no one's picking up their phone. So at some point, he's probably pretty embarrassed. He ends up calling his parents and says, "Hey, I'm totally fine, but I'm letting you know I got into an accident. I'm near Lind, Minnesota. Here's the directions of how to get here. I need you guys to come out here and help me get out of the ditch." And so Brandon's parents say, "Okay, we'll come out and meet you." They use Brandon's directions to get out to this area right near Lind, Minnesota, which was only about 10 minutes away from Marshall, Minnesota, where they lived. They make their way over to the spot, and Brandon's father calls Brandon and says, "Hey, we're here. I'm gonna start flashing my lights as I drive down this road that you've sent us to." And so Brandon's like, "Okay, I'm looking for you. I don't see you, but I'm looking for you." He'd given them really specific directions to where he was. And while they stay on the phone with each other, Brandon's father would flash his lights repeatedly and drive all around the area that had been described as where Brandon was. When Brandon keeps saying that he can't see their car, he doesn't see their lights, he begins to describe again how to get to where he is. And he's telling his parents, "Did you turn on this road? Did you come down this way? Are you near Lind, Minnesota? Are you sure you're where you need to be?" And his parents would respond, "Are you sure you're giving the right directions? Because we're here. We're flashing our lights and you don't see us." At this point, Brandon gets in his car and he starts doing the same thing, flashing his lights. Granted, he can't move his car, so it's only one direction, but he's flashing his lights and he's telling his parents, "Do you see me? I'm flashing my lights." And they both were unable to see each other. Both parties being very frustrated with each other, Brandon just says to his father, "Listen, I'm gonna just walk to Lind. I can see the lights right there. I have a friend in Lind that can probably help me get my car out of here. I'm just gonna walk over there. It's probably like a 30-minute walk to Lind. I'm gonna walk towards the lights." Later, when police interviewed Brandon's father would say, it did not seem like Brandon was drunk. It didn't seem like he was confused. He seemed totally lucid and very easy to talk to. We were having a very normal conversation. Brandon's father stays on the phone with Brandon, and for 47 minutes, Brandon walks down this gravel road away from his car on the phone with his father. His father's just waiting for him to get to Lind so he can, breathe a sigh of relief, make sure his son's okay. And as he's walking towards these lights that Brandon believes is the town of Lind, Brandon all of a sudden goes, "Oh shit!" And then the phone cuts out. Brandon's father's like, "What just happened?" Tries calling him back, no answer. Brandon's father and his mother start driving all over the place, yelling out their window for Brandon, and they can't find him. They end up calling the police, who used Brandon's phone records to generally figure out where he had been when he was on the phone with Brandon's father. And it turns out he was nowhere near Lind. He was 25 miles away in a town called Taunton. So this huge search is launched for Brandon, and there's no sign of him. They never get in touch with him on the phone. They never find his phone. They never find anything to do with Brandon. He just disappeared after seeing something on the road after walking towards some set of lights that he thought was Lind, but it wasn't. It was Taunton. But was he really walking towards town, or what was it? What were the lights he was walking towards? To this day, Brandon's family leaves their front porch light on in hopes that someday Brandon will just show up again. In 1953, Ronald Tomman was a sophomore at Miami University in Ohio. He was a business major, and he was living in a dorm room inside of Fisher Hall. Fisher Hall was a converted insane asylum, and all the students there believed that Fisher Hall was a haunted dorm. It was one of those places where you tried to stay away from if you could. On April 19th of that year, Ron was in his dorm room inside of Fisher Hall. It was very snowy outside. He was listening to the radio and reading a book. At 8 p.m., he must have thought about getting into bed, and when he did, he pulled back the sheets and found that someone had left a dead fish in his bed. And so at 8 p.m., there was an official request from Ron to get new sheets sent up to his room. At about 8:30 p.m., we don't know what it was, but something disturbed Ronald enough to where he ran out into the hall. We don't know what it was. People think it was a disturbing sound or someone yelling for help. We don't know. It's totally speculation, but something alerted him so quickly that he dropped everything he was doing. He left the radio on, lights on, book open, all of his ID cards, his wallet, everything, his shoes, Everything stayed in his room and he ran out into the hall. When his roommate came back at 10 p.m., the door to their room was open and he saw that all of Ronald's things were just laying out. The lights were on, but there was no sign of Ron. Okay, maybe he left and went to his frat house because Ron was a part of a frat. But the next day, when he couldn't get in touch with Ron, he ended up telling authorities that his roommate had been missing since the night before. When police began investigating, they saw that he had been studying a psychology textbook before he ran out into the hall. And he had actually dropped the only psychology course he was taking 3 weeks earlier. His car was still parked right outside the dorm. There was still a couple $100s inside of his bank account. And because he had not taken anything from his room, people believe he basically left in a t-shirt and shorts with no money, no shoes, no anything. A woman living 12 miles away from the campus would later report that the same night he went missing, a man looking like Ronald Tommen, matched his description exactly, showed up at her door. And she opened the door and she said he was visibly frightened. He kept looking around like something was after him, but he seemed very upset. He was totally disheveled. He didn't have a jacket on. He didn't have shoes on. There was no car outside of her house. So this kind of crazy looking guy comes up to the door and he says, "You got to tell me where the bus stop is. I got to get out of here. Where's the bus stop?" And she pointed down the road. He immediately turned and he ran away. And that was the last anybody saw of him. 5 months before Ron ran out of his dorm room to investigate some sound in the hall, or whatever it was in the hall, he had gone to a coroner's office to ask to have his blood typed. And the coroner said in 35 years, he's never had someone come to him and ask him to do a blood type for them. Ronald could have just gone to a local physician on campus to do that for him. So it seems strange that he would have gone to a coroner, of all people, to get his blood typed. Tommen's parents said they spoke to him a week before he went missing, and they said there was nothing unusual about him. He seemed like he was happy, well-adjusted. He had no clear stress in his life. It just didn't add up. To this day, no one knows where he is, and no one knows what he heard in the hall that made him run out and then ultimately vanish. In 2006, Brian Schaefer was a 27-year-old medical student at Ohio State University. He had just lost his mother to a battle with cancer. He was feeling very down. And so his roommate, Clint, decided it would be a good idea on April 1st, which was the end of their classes. There was a little bit of a break coming up, that they should go out and just take his mind off of what he was dealing with and go out to a bar and have a good time. Brian agrees, and so on April 1st, the two of them make their way to the Ugly Tuna Bar, which was located in downtown Columbus, Ohio. Just before 10 p.m. that night, Brian stepped away from the Ugly Tuna to make a phone call to his girlfriend. Her name was Alexis, and she was also a medical student at Ohio State. On the call, there were some niceties exchanged. He said he loved her, and that would be the last time she ever heard his voice. After Brian came back into the bar, Brian and Clint decide they want to leave the Ugly Tuna and do a little bit of bar hopping. So they go to a couple different bars right outside and eventually meet up with one of Clint's friends named Meredith. The three of them continued bar hopping until Brian and Clint decided they wanted to go back to the Ugly Tuna. Meredith offered to drive. So they drive back to the Ugly Tuna, and at about 1:15 in the morning, security cameras right outside the Ugly Tuna pick up the trio walking into the bar. At about 2 a.m., that same camera picks up Brian Schaefer stepping out of the bar and speaking to two college-aged females before at some point saying goodbye to them and walking back into the bar. At some point between 1:15 when the trio arrived and 2 a.m. when Brian is seen alone outside with those two other girls, Brian and Clint and Meredith got separated. Clint and Meredith tried calling him, they tried yelling for him, they couldn't find him. They assumed he must have got tired and just left the bar at some point because he only lived 6 blocks away, and if he wanted to, he could walk home. So they don't think much of it, and they ultimately leave the bar to head home themselves. The following day, Brian's girlfriend, Alexis, tried giving Brian a call, but it went straight to voicemail. She figured he could be sleeping off a hangover, so she didn't think much of it. But as she called him all day long and never got through, she started to become worried and asked Brian's father, Randy, if he could swing by Brian's apartment and just check in on him. When Randy arrived, Brian was not there, but his car was there, and his apartment looked untouched. The bed was still made. There wasn't any signs of Brian having been there recently. At this point, Randy communicates with the police, who immediately launch a huge search for Brian. And the police, they review the footage from the Ugly Tuna, and it shows Brian along with Clint and Meredith making their way into the Ugly Tuna at 1:15 in the morning. Then it shows Brian leaving at 2 a.m. to speak to those two college girls that were outside the bar, but then he goes back into the Ugly Tuna. There is no video footage after that of Brian ever leaving the Ugly Tuna. There was one other exit from the Ugly Tuna that was not covered by a camera. However, it was under very heavy construction and in no way appeared to be a regular exit. It was completely blocked by construction materials, and there was no sign that Brian had ever even gone near that exit from all of the other cameras inside. Police went to surrounding buildings that had cameras pointed in any way near the Ugly Tuna to try to pick up some sign of Brian leaving the bar after 2 a.m., but there weren't any. It was like he went into the bar and never left. And they searched the Ugly Tuna. They looked everywhere. He was not there. To this day, no one has any idea what happened to Brian. Is he still inside the bar? And if he left the bar, how are there no cameras anywhere that are able to pick that up? There was lots of cameras looking at the bar and looking outside the bar. How did he vanish without anybody knowing? Unfortunately, we probably will never know what happened to Brandon Swanson, Ronald Tommen, or Brian Schaefer. But that doesn't mean we can't speculate. In 2014, a 16-year-old girl living in the UK was home one night with her mom, and she was in her bedroom and she was flipping through her phone when she gets a text message. The message was coming from a boy she had recently met via Snapchat. He told her to go to her window and look outside because he was right near her apartment. Now, this girl did not know this boy particularly well, so it was very creepy to be told, "I'm on your property." But either way, she went to the window to look. There's no one out there. And it's late, so she can't really tell if maybe he's hiding or something. But she feels really creeped out by this, and she ends up leaving her bedroom and going into her mother's room and tells her mom, "Hey, I'm gonna sleep in here with you tonight." She doesn't tell her mom about the text message. Maybe she was embarrassed. We don't know. So the girl is laying in bed, her mom's asleep, and as she's about to put her phone down and actually go to sleep, she gets another text from this boy.
"I'm in your house."
She immediately wakes her mom up. She shows her mom's like, "Oh no." She jumps out of bed, every light goes on, runs downstairs to confront this person who's apparently in their apartment, but he's not there. The mother ultimately decides, after not finding anything, that, he's not here. We didn't hear anybody come in the house. The doors are locked, everything's locked. So they did another sweep through the apartment and checked every entrance, locked everything. Let's just go to bed. So they go back into the mother's bedroom, shut and lock the door, and the two of them go to sleep. The next morning, the mother is still sleeping. The girl wakes up a little bit early and she decides to go into her bedroom. As soon as she walked in, she would later tell reporters that immediately she felt like she was being watched. And so she starts doing a cursory check of her small bedroom. She, pulls the door aside, looks behind the door. She opens her closet, pulls her clothes aside, looking around, there's no one in there. And she's thinking to herself, that boy got to my head and I'm psyching myself out. She looks down at her bed, and she used to keep all of her shoes lined up next to her bed. And she was really OCD about how she organized her shoes. And she noticed that one set of shoes was out of place. It was a subtle thing that really only she would be able to recognize. And so she gets down on her knees to rearrange the shoes, and that's when she sees something out of the corner of her eye. Her bed was slightly elevated, and so she had a little bit of a line of sight under the bed as soon as she was kneeling. And under the bed is a face, and it's the face of the boy who had said, "I'm outside your house," and he's the same one who said, "I'm in your house." And he's smiling up at her and he's clutching his phone, looking at her. She runs out of the room. She runs to her mom's room and says, "He's in there, he's in there." The mother comes barreling in, protective mama coming in. The boy's out from under the bed. The boy, in a panic, runs to the window, pulls it open, and jumps out of the window. The boy would turn out to be Kyle Ravenscroft, and he had very quickly become obsessed with this girl. And he just wanted to be close to her. And so when she got that text message that was, "Hey, come look out your window," he was hiding. And when she went into her mom's room, he could actually see her go into the mom's room, and he climbed up the side of the apartment into the window that was open, shut it, and climbed under the bed, so that when the mother and the daughter were searching the house, he was already in the house. So they locked him into the house. He was ultimately given a very small sentence. I think it was a couple weeks in jail, a fine, and some community service. But no matter what the sentence was, I'm sure that girl will have to deal with the trauma of that event for the rest of her life. In 2014, a couple came back to their house in Seattle, Washington, and found it absolutely destroyed, but in totally baffling ways. All of their shoes that had the soles inside of the shoe ripped out. Someone had taken a big can of paint, taken the lid off, and flipped it upside down on the top of the toilet. Their mail had been ripped to pieces and it was laying all over the ground. Their clothes had been ripped out of all the drawers. There was this piece of wood that they didn't know where it came from that had a single screw screwed into it that had been wedged between a door and the door frame, but it wasn't blocking it from opening. It was just like someone wedged it in the middle of the door for some reason. There was hand lotion all over the door handles of some of the doors in their house. There was also a purse sitting on their bed that had the ID card of a 27-year-old woman who they didn't recognize. The couple does a quick look around but is worried someone might still be there, so they leave and they call the police. The police show up and they're just as confused as the couple because nothing was stolen. There was no sign of forced entry. It was just like someone came in there and wrecked the house and then left. It was very confusing. And so ultimately the police just went back to their precinct to write up the report and told the couple, hey, lock your doors and, be on the lookout for someone trying to rob you again. After the police left, the couple began cleaning up the mess inside of their house. And after a couple hours of doing that, they decided, we'll finish this up tomorrow. They're laying in bed and they start hearing this sound that sounds like an animal dying coming from underneath their bed. Now, they didn't think this could be a person because there was almost no space underneath their bed. It was, barely any clearance under their bed. So they're thinking an animal must have gotten in here. We had the doors wide open as we were cleaning stuff out. Maybe an animal got in here. They're like, no, we're not going to deal with this. They jump up and run out of the bedroom and call the police again. Police show up, they go into the bedroom, and there is a person underneath their bed, 90-pound, 27-year-old crazy woman who was high on meth, carrying a knife and a hypodermic needle. And she was under there burrowing a hole underneath the bed. She was the same woman that was on that ID card in the purse that they had found earlier. Her story was she climbed up the tree that was outside the window and jumped into the second floor window while the couple was gone. She ransacked the house for reasons we don't understand and then went under the bed. And there was so little clearance under the bed that the couple did not think to look under there for people. So that whole time they were cleaning up, she was still in the house. Luckily, she didn't get all the way through. Who knows what she would have done if she'd actually punctured all the way through. In 2017, a young college girl who was living alone in an apartment started to notice that something didn't feel right. In the morning, she'd get up and she'd open her fridge, and some of the food that she would leave in there, it appeared like there was less of it. A couple times she would wake up and she'd walk out into her living room and one of the pillows would be in a different position or had even fallen off the couch. There was just little things happening in her apartment that collectively was actually pretty unsettling and was starting to scare her. And she started having these nightmares at night that someone was breaking into her apartment. One night, she wakes up from one of those nightmares and she's drenched in sweat. She decides she's going to take a shower before she goes back to sleep. She goes to her bathroom and she brings her phone. She would play music while she was taking a shower. She would put her phone right up against the window that was next to the shower curtain so at any time she could reach over, change the song, and then keep showering. She had a very old door on the bathroom where there was actually a key on the inside of the door that if you wanted to, you could actually lock the door and then take the key out, and the only way to open it again, even from the inside, is with that key. So she's taking her shower, she's listening to music, and at some point she wants to change the song. And so she pulls the shower curtain back just enough to reach her hand out to touch next on her phone when she stops. The phone was reflecting something in the middle of her bathroom, and it was a dark figure standing in her bathroom, shoulders squared up to the actual shower. So someone is standing in the middle of her bathroom facing her right now. I don't know how she did this, but she stayed composed. She retracted her hand, turned the water all the way to scalding hot. She took the shower head out, and once the water was so hot there was steam all over the bathroom, in one fell swoop, she ripped open the curtain and sprayed the water directly on the face of the person standing right there next to her. She runs past this person who's now clutching their face and screaming in pain. She grabs the key on her door on the inside, locks it, takes the key out, runs out of her bathroom, slams it behind her, locking the intruder in the bathroom. The girl runs into her kitchen to get her butcher knife. She had one nice knife, but when she went into the kitchen, her one butcher knife, she couldn't find it. She ditches the idea of getting a knife and instead grabs a towel and runs out of her apartment. She makes it outside. She calls the police. The police show up. The girl gives them the key to the bathroom, They go into her apartment and they unlock the bathroom and they pull this person out. It was this crazy lady who used to live at this apartment, and she had apparently made copies of the keys and had been sneaking in whenever this girl wasn't there, or at night she would sneak into her apartment and she would sleep there on the couch and then leave before the girl woke up. So as the police bring this woman away, one of the officers breaks off and goes over to the girl who owns the apartment, and he holds up an evidence bag, and it's the girl's butcher's knife. The woman had taken it from the kitchen and was standing in the bathroom waiting for her to get out of the shower. And the officer just says, looks like she wanted her apartment back. In 1981, a 9-year-old boy discovered that if he was really quiet, he could sneak out of his bedroom at night, go down into the kitchen, and eat as much junk food as he wanted. One night in the summer that year, his family went out for this huge dinner at this amazing restaurant, and when they came back, they had all these leftovers. And the boy really wanted to eat the remainder of the sweet and sour pork. He was really excited about it. So everyone goes to bed, and he's really deliberate. He starts sneaking down the stairs, being ultra careful. He gets to the end of the stairs, hasn't made a sound. And that's when he freezes because he hears what sounds like a fork making a little clinking sound against the counter. And he thinks, my parents have got to be in there, and if they see me, I'm going to be totally busted, so I don't want them to see me. And so he begins to turn his head around the corner because he was obscured by the wall, and he pokes his head just far enough in to where he can see into the kitchen. And standing in the middle of the kitchen is this skinny man that he's never seen before, drinking milk directly from the carton with the fridge wide open. The kid holds back a scream, sneaks back up the stairs. When he finally gets upstairs, he runs into his parents' room and he tells them what's going on. The father runs downstairs, ready to confront whoever's there. There's no one there. There's not even a sign that anyone was there. So they look everywhere and they can't find anything. And so the parents don't believe him, and everybody goes back to bed, and that's that. The boy was very confident at what he saw. Although he did feel like, I guess I could have imagined it, but he started paying really close attention to everything in his house. In the mornings, he would go downstairs before everybody else, and he would see if there was any sign of someone having been in the kitchen. He noticed at one point that the napkin holder had been moved to the wrong side of the counter. He also noticed one time there was a mug that was in the sink that no one had used the night before. And so he's thinking that someone is sneaking into our house. I don't know how, I don't know where, but I'm confident that it's still happening. But his parents didn't believe him. 3 months after the boy has seen this person in his kitchen, he's in his bedroom, he's just laying there, and he's looking up at the vent on his ceiling, an air conditioning vent. And as he's looking at it, he sees a pair of eyes go over the vent, looking down at him. And they blink, and he can tell it's eyes looking at him. It takes him a second to process it, but he freaks, runs out of his room, runs to his parents' room, and he can barely talk. He's like, there's someone in the vent. The parents run into his room, they check crawl spaces, the attic, they're shining a light into the vent. They can't find anything. And so once again, it turns into, you're making this up, you have an overactive imagination, there's nothing going on in this house. But a week goes by, and their house started to smell really bad. And the majority of the stink was coming from that vent in the boy's room. And even worse, there were maggots falling out of that vent. So they got the air conditioning people over to have a look, and they were totally confident that what they were going to find is a dead animal up inside the vent. But that's not what they find. They find a dead man who had been living in their ceiling. There was literally a cot that had been set up inside of their ceiling. There were drawings of this boy taken from the perspective of looking down at him through the vent. Someone had been living in their ceiling over the boy's bed for months and then died up there. The man was never identified and was buried a John Doe. And I'm sure the parents felt really bad about not believing their son. In 2013, a young woman was living alone in an apartment, and she was on the phone with her boyfriend. As she's chatting with her boyfriend, she decides to go get her mail. She walks into the main hall to this area where all the mail slots are on the wall. She's chatting, she opens up her slot, she gets her mail, shuts her slot, and then she walks back down the hall to her apartment, opens the door, goes back in, and she goes to her bedroom. And she's sitting on her bed, feet on the floor, and she's got her phone, and she kind of tucks it against her shoulder, and she's rifling through her mail. And as she's flipping through her mail, the phone drops. And the way that it lands is it kind of bounces backwards underneath the bed. She puts her mail in the bed, and she gets down on her chest to extend her arm out to get her phone that's now well under the bed. And as soon as she starts looking for the phone, she freezes and she stifles a scream. There's a man in the fetal position tucked against the far side underneath the bed, not looking at her. The girl stays composed. She gets her phone. She goes, "Hey, I'm going to take a quick shower. Let me call you right back." With her phone in hand, she walks right out, goes into her bathroom, which is right next door, shuts it, locks it, turns on the shower, opens her window, and jumps out. She was on the first floor. Goes right across the street and hides behind a car, and she calls the police. The police show up, they go inside, and they bring out this crazy, deranged-looking man. As they're taking him away in handcuffs, one of the officers comes over to her, and he says to her, "You're very lucky you did what you did, because we found him in your apartment standing outside of the bathroom holding a knife. He was waiting for you." The girl believes that when she went to get her mail, she was distracted because she was talking to her boyfriend and she must not have shut her apartment door, at which point this guy must have snuck in and gotten under her bed. The man was committed to a mental institution and the girl's boyfriend moved in with her the next day.